Hello, everyone, and welcome to Drawing Down the Stars. I'm your host, Snappy, and today we're joined with Andrew Auld Boy. Andrew is a amateur historian, a martial artist, and a musician, and he specializes in the history and mythology of the British Isles. I highly recommend you all go check out his channel, Old Boy, and you can find amazing discussions on mythology, the origins of the various British peoples, as well as even archaeological explorations of sites that are local to him. So it's a wonderful channel, and I highly recommend you all check it out. So thanks for joining me, Andrew.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be here. So thank you very much.
Amazing. So I just want to begin with sort of your origins. So, like, what are your roots, and how did you get interested in all of this mythology?
Okay, so I'm born in a region in the northwest of England, very close to the Scottish border. And just growing up, you kind of hear about the Romans that inhabited the region. You hear about the Anglo-Saxons, the Vikings, the Normans, and I just kind of went all through my life, not really having too much of an interest in it, other than my family they were very into the outdoors. We're country folks, and we'd get out and about quite a lot, and these old ruins would just always be around. So it was always in the back of my mind that they existed. And it wasn't until I got older and that I started getting more of an interest into it. And it actually started when I saw an old map from around about 400-500 AD. And it was just before the Anglo-Saxon invasion. And it had Wales as listed from being from the very south coast all the way up, even beyond where the Scottish border is today. And that was all classed as Wales. And then the area I'm from is the Lake District, and it's called Cumbria. And the Welsh, they don't call themselves Welsh, they call themselves Cymru. And then I found out that Cumbria has the same root as Cymru, Wales. And that kind of blew me away, because your whole life you just think Wales is just this little area in the southwest,
Right?
And that kind of blew me away. And then I realised that Cumbria and parts of what is today known as Scotland, they feature prominently in the Welsh mythologies and histories, and it was called Yrhenoglaeth, which means the Old North, and that's when I started getting sucked into it.
Right.
So
It's like a rabbit hole you found yourself just getting dug into.
Yeah. And then as I look into it, you find out things like some of the best preserved Celtic figurines, masks and heads, they were found in the area. And you're like, why didn't they teach us about this stuff when we were at school? It was always the Romans and the Anglo-Saxons. And you realize there's quite a lot of heritage in the area. And it just kind of blew my mind that people weren't talking about it really. You know what I mean? And then I started researching it myself, and having to find out about it through my own means, and it just opened so many doors for me, really. I even started learning the Welsh language because of it. I had that much of an interest in it, and it was mainly just connecting with the roots of the area I was born, I suppose. So yeah,
that's amazing. That's such a cool story. And it's something that I think a lot of people of European descent can kind of like relate to, just because like there has been this kind of washing away of that ancient history as things became more and more Christian, right? Like my first introduction to a lot of this Welsh text was like reading, I didn't even know at first that I'm reading this Christian sanitized version, right? Like that these figures are gods. You think that they're just people, right? And they
just kind of get
lands very different than they actually are.
Yeah, they get absorbed into kind of saints. They become saints and things like that. And you're like, well, they originally weren't, but you can see how they had to accommodate it. So yeah, it's you have to do quite a lot of digging and really get to the bottom of where these figures come from, because quite often they predate the Christian by quite a lot. So
right. Well, that's why this is where it starts to get super interesting for me with a lot of this stuff that you've been talking about, with the origins and everything, because when
Yeah.
I look at some of these myths, right, like I see some connections, like there's these general themes, right? Like you look at a character like Branwen, right, where
Yeah.
she's abducted and she has the magic cauldron and she can
Yeah.
speak to birds. It's like, to me, that seems like it screams of a Medea type figure. What are your thoughts on something like that?
Yeah, as I was speaking to you just before we went live, I was led towards the Greek pantheon from the Celtic pantheon, because I was a big game changer for me was finding the book tab in the Google search, because you can find old books that go back, if you do some trawling through the searches, you can find books from the 1600s and earlier. And a lot of these old books, they were kind of they were saying things like the Druids were worshipping Apollo and things, and I was like, this is quite crazy to me. But then that led me to the Greek pantheon, and that's when I started seeing how the cauldron was originally portrayed in these older Greek pantheons, and I started seeing parallels between how it was used in the Celtic mythology. So I do believe that these, it's almost like a mutation of the story over time and space, if that makes sense. And
Yeah.
the motifs are definitely there. The magic cauldron, it brings people back to life. There's soldiers die, they go into the cauldron, they come back to life, but what can they not do when they come out of the cauldron? They can't speak. You know what I
Right.
mean? It's crazy.
It's so kind of direct. And like, I know for my own research and studying and trying to draw these connections with the Indian peoples, what I started to notice was the connection with the Brahma bull. And what I found is that there's all of these tribal groups spanning all the way from West Africa into India that are traveling with this particular bull. And then you notice all of these points along that route where you see this mystery. So what I want to like, what are your thoughts and what is your perception of the scholarship bringing this to the British Isles? Because like that's a land route, and when I look at the Greeks are kind of seafaring, but how do you
Yep.
get from like the Black Sea and the Mediterranean in Africa to the Isles?
Okay, well, when I've been looking into this, you see, the way that the angle that I take is, I'm not an expert. I'm not, I'm coming at this more of like how an investigative journalist would. So you take an idea. Some of these old stories are saying, oh, the Irish were either Scythian or they were from Greece or the Med or the Black Sea. So the way I look at it is, I go, okay, well, let's have a look and what evidence is there to support or to that kills that idea. And I'll pull various different resources. I'll go to the mythology itself, I'll go to archaeological records, and I'll pull it all together. And that's the way that I'm kind of looking at it. It's more evidence based. I don't want to speculate or offer my sort of opinions. I want to stay true to what we can actually find. So in this instance, where I was finding a lot of books that were saying they were Scythian and things, I go, okay, well, I went to the mythologies. So the Bor Gabala, which is like an Irish annals, the Ulster Cycle, things like that. And you could see that they were talking about these migrations that happened. And there was several migrations that they say occurred over a period of time, and they all seem to say they were coming from the Black Sea region or the Mediterranean. So you had the first one was a group of people called the people of Partholon, then the people of Nemeth or Nemed, and then the Tuatha De Danann. And the Tuatha De Danann were supposedly of the tribe of Nemed, and it said that essentially they came from the Black Sea, and they sailed with the Riffian Mountains to the right hand. And the Riffian Mountains, when you have a look into it, they didn't have an exact location for them in antiquity, but they believed them to be in the north, sort of running across the Ural sort of area. So if they were to his right hand, that means he's traveling from east to west. and it said it was a large, like a narrow sea, they called it, a narrow sea which empties into the Black Sea. So obviously, logic would dictate that would be the Danube. So when you look into the Danube, you see that it's been used all through antiquity. The Greeks were using it; they called it the Istros, and they were trading up and down the Danube. And then dotted along the Danube, you had a lot of the Celtic tribes. You can find instances of the Brigantes dotted around. And then I thought, well, the Danube only gets you so far. But then I started doing some more research, and there was a guy who he studies portages and the archaeology in the region, and he said there was what's called a portage, which is where they would carry the boats over land, goods, things like that. And there was a portage over an area, and I believe it was something like 150 kilometers in distance between the Danube and the Rhine. But indeed, there were carrying boats and goods over this portage, and then they could jump into the Rhine, and then through the Rhine they could sail up to the North Sea. And this is exactly what we find in the mythology, where these people, they sail from the Black Sea with the Riffian Mountains to the right hand until they get to the North Sea. And then they would sail with Europe to the left hand, which would obviously bring you around France and through the English Channel, and then they would reach Ireland and things like that. So when you look into it, it actually isn't as crazy as it seems. And
no, it does, because it also, like, it brings me this idea of like later peoples, right? Like the Vikings. We know for certain we're making this route, right? They were going and
yes,
we're working for the Byzantine Empire, right? We have all that evidence, so
yeah,
we know that people are doing that.
And it makes sense because how many major cities are on the Danube? You've got so many. It cuts through so many major cities, and obviously they would have started off as a lot smaller, and over time they grow. And it got to the stage where Charlemagne actually wanted to make a canal that connected them, which took the labour of carrying the goods and the ships over this portage. So you can see how important it was that they actually then thought, we need to build some infrastructure here to make it easier. So very, very interesting. And then when you look at the name of the Danube as well, and so Dan, they believe that the sources I've seen, they sort of attribute that to the goddess, which the Tuatha De Danann named themselves after. So this is where you get into Dan, and apparently they settled in Denmark as well, which is Denmark. I believe Mark is the land of Dan. So it's crazy when you piece it all together. And for sure, at the very least, there was the places were a lot more connected than we're led to believe, and there was trade going on. I mean, they've even found in Ireland, they found an ape skull, which they believe for that time period it should be confined to sort of North Africa. So there was definitely trade, and this is from 100 BC, something like that. So the trade was definitely going on, trade and travel. It wasn't as isolated as no,
I think this is a theme that more as archaeology has improved, that we're just uncovering more and more, is that we're recognizing now that these people were far more mobile. They stretched far larger distances, and they were far more integrated than we ever once assumed. Like, I just think about, like, in North America, a big thing that we discovered is like that the Iroquois Confederacy had articles from Mesoamerica. So like you're spanning the entirety of the Americas, right? Like, you're seeing this all over the place. So we need to be having more of this dialogue about these connections, even if they're not literal direct connections. There is this cultural exchange that's happening. Just like now, we're seeing this hybridization of cultures. You're seeing the adoption of ideas that are moving across these vast distances, right?
Yeah, for sure. It's phenomenal, and the more information that comes out, it's like when I was studying for my my last presentation I was doing, there was even archaeological research that says the Faroe Islands and Iceland, they were finding remains that they believed were Celtic, which is prior to the Scandinavian people getting there, which again that ties in with the mythology of the Tuatha De Danann, because apparently I found one source and it was from the 1800s, and it was the Royal Institute of Anthropology for Britain and Ireland, and it said that they were Greek, and it said something along the lines of they were kind of like druids for the Greeks, and they were battling an invasion from Syria, and the Syrians had their own druid, and apparently it sounds crazy, but the Syrians druid, that his magic was beating the Tuatha De Danann. So because they knew they were being defeated, they fled. And it said that they fled to the Lachlan lands, which is an old word for Scandinavia. Wow. And they lived there for a period of time. And it said that they taught the people the arts and things while they were there. And then they eventually came to Britain and Ireland after that. So even though the archaeological evidence they found doesn't place it back to this era where we believe the Tuatha De Danann were from, it still predates the Scandinavian settlements, and it's an ongoing research. So who knows what else they're going to find? But it's incredible, really, when you think about it.
Right, and it's also like this whole period of history is almost completely lost to us, and it's wild to me. Like a lot of people, when they think of the Bronze Age collapse, they think of it only happening in the Mediterranean and in India, but it's also happening to the Celts, right? And like, this is something we need to be recognizing. Like, they had a massive culture that spread everywhere, and then all of a sudden is regulated, or spread most of Europe, and then all of a sudden is regulated to basically the British Isles and Brittany. You know?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, when you look at the Danube, you can kind of trace there's a group called the Brigantes, and I believe they named themselves the Brigantes because they worshipped Brigantia, or Brigid, the goddess Brigid, as she's later known. And you can find them dotted around the Danube. They were even in the Lake Constance area, which is kind of in between the Danube and the Rhine. And then you can find them in Ireland and Scotland. So you can see that, Ireland and Britain. So you can see, you can kind of trace, just with this one tribe, you can kind of trace them dotted around all across Europe and then to the Isles as well. So you can kind of see that there's those migrations taking place. And I'm fortunate enough to live close to their city, to the Brigantes. It's called Isurium Brigantium. And that's what it was called after the Romans got here. So you can go there, you can see the mosaics and everything, and it's incredible, really. I just feel so lucky to be close by to a lot of these sites.
But like, you're saying this stuff with all of this evidence, and yet like, this is the first until I discovered your channel, I never even was really aware of this until like we're having these discussions with Amon. Like, I never knew how connected the British peoples were to all this Greek mystery. Like, it's what, like, I always thought it was like, you see a lot of this writing in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance where they're tying into the Greek, and I always assumed that was just because of the place of the Greco-Roman culture, it's turning this whole perception on its head.
Yeah, it's crazy, and when you see some of the images of Brigantia in the Roman era, the Romans syncretized her with Minerva, and there's a couple of statues where she's even got the Gorgon's head on her chest, So
wow,
it's crazy.
That's so cool. But can you talk to me more about the Tuatha De Danann, because this is something I'm vaguely familiar with. Like, is that related to the Isle of the Mist too? Like, what's going on here? Like,
so after they got to Scandinavia and Denmark, it said they were necromancers. That's what some of the sources say. They were necromancers, and So after they got to Scandinavia, it said that they were welcomed there because they were versed in all of the arts, such as like language. What's the word I'm looking for? Buildings, structural. The word, my brain's just gone on a go slow there. But they were versed in all of the arts, so they were welcomed there, and they stayed there for some time. And then it says when they arrived to the British Isles, they came in a cloud of smoke or mist, and they descended upon upon the isles. So that's what the terminology is that they use, that they descend in a cloud of smoke. So I don't know whether that's kind of like how the Scythians are described, where it's a certain kind of smoke, but
Oh, it is like, well, at least with the Scythians, we know that they're bathed in cannabis smoke.
Yeah, exactly.
Says, right?
yeah, that's what I was thinking too. So
that's wild. That's so cool.
And it says that they brought with them some legendary sort of weapons. So the Stone of Destiny, a magical spear, a magical sword, and a magical cauldron. So they were like the 4 mythical items that they brought with them as well, which they obviously seem like ritualistic sort of items.
Right. And then, okay, so building upon this then, okay, so one thing we see within the Greek mystery traditions is this idea of this secret hidden language, right? The Orphic Vox, and this idea of obscuring and hiding these drug references. Do you see any of that within the Welsh and British traditions, especially within any of the archaeology? Have you noticed any of that?
I mean, there's always the reference to the snakes. I've been in trying to reconnect with the area that I was from. I've been chasing the dragon, so to speak. This has been the big thing for me. I've always been fascinated by it, fascinated by the story of the snakes being chased out of Ireland. This kind of thing. I've got the snake. I've got the serpent tattoo. That's how much it meant to me. And so yeah, the snakes they're integral. It's interwoven into the legends. And when I started looking at the Welsh mythology, this is something I've just started doing, is having a comparison and having the Greek in mind as I'm reading it. And Geoffrey of Monmouth's work, which is a work from around 1150 AD, he wrote Vita Merlini, which is the life of Merlin, and it's originally written in Latin, and I believe it's written in hexameter format to begin with.
Oh
wow! And then I mean, this is just what a literary guy was saying. A source that I found, he wrote a book on it, and he was versed in that. Again, I'm not an expert on hexameter or anything like that, but he was saying it was written in hexameter format. And at the start of it, Geoffrey of Monmouth, he even invokes the muse. In the Welsh, it's called Arwen, spelt Awen, but the W is like a O sound, so it's Arwen, and he invokes Arwen so that it can give him the it's almost like the mead of poetry. It gives you the poeticness to be able to convey it, and he says, I invoke Arwen so that I can get this down and write it down properly. And then he's referencing Ovid's work. He even compares Merlin to Silenus, and then in some of the lines, Merlin's he just starts talking about his wolf friend, and this is after he's being compared to Silenus, and you're like, is this some Apollo kind of reference going on here too? And basically Merlin, there's a war, there's a battle, and it's all the British tribes, the warring together. And he sees, his friends and family sort of killed. He goes crazy. He runs off into the forest, and he lives this life in the forest amongst the trees, surviving off the herbs and the roots. He lives like a life of asceticism. And the king's trying to get him back because he's like, I need my prophet. I need this guy back. So he sends somebody out to go and find him. But Merlin he's mad. He's gone mad. He's crazy. He's up on the mountains. This is where he inhabits. He's on the mountains watching the waterfalls and the animals. And this guy has to sneak up on him with a lyre, right? And he has to play this lyre to calm him down. And he starts singing this song about his wife, saying, oh, your wife's sad. She's crying. She looks dead, all this stuff. So then Merlin snaps out of this madness, and he goes, okay, I'll go back to the king. And then when he goes back, the king's trying to give him all this money and wealth, and he's saying, please stay with me. Look, we can give you money, we can give you wealth. And he refuses the wealth. He's like, no, I'm not interested. He said, wealth twists people's hearts. in a nutshell, I'm paraphrasing here, and he tries to run away again, and he tries to go back into the mountains, and then he's talking about the morning star. He watches the stars and the movements of the stars, and he's talking about Phoebus and the morning star and stuff like that. So for me, this stuff's all interwoven into there. I've only got up to the first sort of third of it because I was in the middle of doing this, and I thought I need to give a little bit of context before I start diving into the mythology. I want to give a little bit of context, and that's why I've done some more historical based sort of videos, so that people can watch them first and just have in the back of the mind that there was travel was going on beforehand. So then when I start comparing Greek mythology with Celtic mythology, it's not just like some crazy sort of idea.
It does seem a little out of left field if you're not familiar with the context, right? So, but like it seems very clear to me, if there isn't a direct origin, there's at least direct contact.
Yeah,
there's
at the very
sharing
least,
of ideas, right?
At the very least, Geoffrey of Monmouth is he's clued up on his Greek works at the very least, and whether he's trying to show off and try to recreate some kind of hexameter prose, I don't know at this stage, but it's all woven in there. And interestingly enough, Geoffrey of Monmouth might have come from a Norman family, but I don't know. Just to give a little bit of context to that, when the Anglo-Saxons started conquering in Britain, there was quite a few families fled to Brittany, and Brittany itself means Little Britain, and they established a colony there, and that's why today they still speak a dialect which is similar to Welsh. And obviously Britain is right next to Normandy, so then they're kind of intermixed with the Normans, and then when they came back over to reconquer from the Anglo-Saxons, there would have been British families or people who were of British descent coming back. And there's one source that says that they may have even supplied the ships to the Normans to do that. So they would have very much seen it as trying to take back some of the country. And I think that's why you have this mix of mythology, because even when you look at the mythology of Brittany, you have some similarities there. So it's definitely crossed the channel.
Okay, that's so cool. One thing I wanted to get some clarification on. So when we're looking at the origins, like it's one thing it's very clear in the British Isles is that the people quickly divide among tribal lines, and like you get many different variations of these groups. So like, are we seeing multiple origins? Are most of these people coming from like a Greek Scythian background, or are there any groups that stand out, at least prior to the Anglo-Saxon invasion?
You know what? When you look at it, it does seem like they weren't just a homogenous group. They did seem to be very, very tribal, and it wasn't until I believe they started using the term Cymru, which is what the Welsh call themselves today. That means fellow countrymen. So they were quite tribal to begin with, and it wasn't until an external threat came that they seemed to recognize the kinship that they had, and they kind of banded together under this banner of Cymru, fellow countrymen. And I think prior to this, you can see that there were Brigantes in Ireland, there were Brigantes in Britain, and some of the old sources. So the mythology of the Britons says that they were descended from a guy called Brutus. So it could either be pronounced Brutus, or if it's in the Welsh pronunciation, it would be Britus, because a U in Welsh is pronounced like a English I. So it could be Britus. Now, apparently he was of Trojan descent through Ennius. And something happened. It varies depending on where you read. But he might have had something to do with accidentally killing his mother in childbirth, and then accidentally killing his father with an arrow later in life, and he was exiled. This is from one of the sources. So he travels across Europe. He spends some time in France, and one of his either his brothers or his companions die, and there was a city named after this person there. Then he comes to England and founds New Troy, which was the basis for London. And you've got a tribe there. And when you look at the coins they've got, and they've got Bronze Age spears that have been found in the River Thames, and you just look at it and you just think, could it be?
No,
And
because
then
this is blowing my mind, because that sounds like Jason, right? Like Jason is founding London. And I do know some history of the city of London. I know that the Romans identified it as ancient when they first went there, and they gave it special protection because it was seen as a sacred trading place well before the Romans ever even arrived.
That's it, Nova Troium or something, I believe. I can't remember off the top of my head exactly how it was styled, but this is how it was styled in the annals. And you even have people like Milton of Paradise Lost sort of fame writing about this. I mean, this is a very, very educated guy. When you look at how many languages he spoke, and he was a civil servant. He was in a high place of authority at one period of time, and even he's writing about it. And he's in his book, because he wrote a book on the history of Britain. He's actually got. I'm trying to think where he got this from, but he said there was Brutus went to a temple of Diana, and he asked for an oracle of where he should sail. And there's this oracle that's written in Latin. It could have been by Gildas, who originally wrote it. Now, Gildas was a Briton, but he wrote in Latin, and I believe he was serving under a Roman. And he wrote this down in Latin, but apparently he copied that from a Greek script. So I've been trying to find this Greek script to try and authenticate it, so to speak. But it's very interesting that he asked for an oracle of where he should go, and she said, sail to the west and you'll find an expanse of sea, and you'll find a sea-girt isle, an isle surrounded by, an island, basically. And apparently it was uninhabited, and he could found things there. He could found a dynasty there. But prior to that, there's other stories, because he apparently was there. He was late to the party. Apparently the Goidelic branch, who are more associated with the Irish and Scots, apparently they were there first. So my interest is really old books, and I have a habit of stumbling across these really old books. So I go and visit my mum. She's back in the Lake District. I'm in Yorkshire at the minute, which is where the Brigantes were. The Lake District was inhabited by the Corvetti tribe, which means of the deer. And when I go back, because my family's pretty big here, I've got, kids and stuff. So she'll always hire like a lodge in the lakes. And when I go there, I always find these old books. And there was an old book. It was written by a Welsh member of Parliament. And it was I think it was called The Life of David Lloyd George, who was the Prime Minister of Wales at one point. It was written in 1913. And in the history of Wales, it basically says that the first inhabitants were the Iberians. Then it says the Goidelics, who are basically the Irish and who would become the Irish and Scots. They came next. And what happened is they pushed the Iberians to the extremities. So kind of like the highlands of Scotland, the Lake District region in the mountains, and they had the pastures. And what it says is these Iberians, they were smaller, and they also were using stone tools. And when these Bronze Age people came, they were larger in stature and they had the bronze weapons, armor and stuff. And basically the stone tools couldn't compete, which is why they managed to push them out. But then later, when the Britons came, apparently the two previous groups joined forces. And then they too were kind of dispersed, and the Britons kind of inhabited. So I've gone off on a tangent there. I apologize.
No, that's a good tangent.
In a nutshell, I believe that there was lots of small groups and small tribes. And to put the icing on the cake, even more recently, there's a dialect of Scottish called Doric. And I never gave it much thought until I read that the reason why it's so unique is because it preserves the digamma vowel. And I was like, well, only somebody who's kind of studied it to a higher level of education would kind of know what that meant. Really, it's not something that just some random guy on the internet would just start writing. And
no
then
one would make that claim without a lot of
yeah,
education.
exactly. and that's when I started thinking, is there more to this? And then there's an island called Iona nearby, and then I'm like, so are these old books right? Did they come from Greece or the Mediterranean? Do you know what I mean? It's mind-blowing, really.
It is, because like, I never gave it much thought, but when you start to put the pieces together, it's like there's so much there. It's like, how did we not notice it? Right?
That's it. And I'm not saying it definitely is, but I'm saying,
No.
when you start looking into it, and this is what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be asking the question, are they? And then I'm going to have a look and see what evidence we've got. And then, if I can get some experts in various fields to come and talk about it, then that's what I want to do, essentially.
That's
is to see if we can get to the bottom of it. So
I'm excited to see where you go with your channel, because it's already so good.
Thank you.
You doing the mix of like the readings and the overview of the academic literature with your own thoughts, and then the exploration of these archaeological sites. It's much needed. It's good content. So
thank you. That's really kind.
That to get like academics to talk with you. That's wonderful.
That's the plan. As I said, I'm a musician. So the way I'm predominantly a musician and a martial artist, but I'm predominantly, it's like a DJ. A DJ doesn't write his own music, but he can pull things together and he can bring something else to it. And I'm kind of seeing myself as doing that type of thing, but with this history and mythology. I'm going to pull from experts, pull it all together and present it, and then, let people make up their own minds about it.
Right. No, that's wonderful, right? And this is it's such a crazy, almost endless topic, like we're never going to have enough evidence right now to know for sure, so we can pour over all of this till the end of time. But
that's it.
Oh wow, it's so cool. But like, one thing I wanted to dig into with you is like, a mutual acquaintance friend of ours, Rat King, was bringing up that there is these really cool so one of my favorite figures is Cully, right? And I've noticed these direct parallels with this figure of Morrigan, but Morrigan seems very obscure, and you see this triple face, you see all that. Like, can you explain what's going on here, who she is and what she represents, like within the
for sure
context?
So just again, to give that a bit of context, you've got multiple sort of retellings. You've got multiple writings from different sources. You've got mainly the Irish sources, and you've got the Welsh sources where you've got a similar character. They seem to be from different times, and I think what you've got to bear in mind is that the language changes over time as well. So this is why I think we've got the same but different kind of stories going on. Do you know what I mean? But
yeah,
I'll give you a breakdown of it first. I just wanted to give that as kind of like a brief overall. So
appreciate it.
You've got the Morrigan, and now in modern Irish it's Morrigan, and the Ard Ri are high kings in Irish. So Ri is king, but she's Riorgan. So it's Morrigan, which is translated in the modern Irish to mean phantom queen or great queen. And that's kind of how it's kind of presented in the modern era. But when you start going back to some of the other entries about her, you can kind of see that there's something else going on. So Morrigan, she appears in the Ulster cycle, and the interesting thing with the Ulster cycles is they seem to be based. There's a lot about cattle raids. These bulls, the cattle are crazy important, and she's got quite a lot to do with Cú Chulainn. Now, Cú Chulainn, he's like a legendary warrior. He gets his name because Chulainn is the smith. He's like a legendary smith, and he kills his guard dog in self-defense. And so he has to take his place as the new guard until he gets a new dog. So he becomes called Cú Chulainn, the dog of Chulainn. So Cú is the dog aspect, Now, in modern Welsh, a dog is a ci as opposed to cu, but the Welsh u is pronounced like an I. So even if you pronounced cu in Welsh, you pronounce it key.
So this is Heracles, basically.
it could be. There's something along those lines, because he does have trials to undertake later. He does have trials. Now, the things he's known for is his battle frenzy. And basically what happens in one of these trials is he gets challenged by Medba's warriors, and he has to battle them in single battle. And he's renowned. He's known for his battle frenzy. And Morrigan appears to him to offer him aid in exchange for her love, type thing. And what she does is she disguises herself as 3 different animals: an eel, a wolf, and finally a heifer, a white cow. And every time she tries to obstruct him, basically, because he's turned her down. And every time he ends up injuring her. And then after the battles are won, she's there with these injuries, and she turns up as a crone. She disguises herself as a crone, and she's milking a cow. And she basically offers him the milk from the cow. And I believe the term is the milk from the 3rd teat. And in return, she just asks him to bless her, and that heals her 3 wounds that she receives. And then when she reveals herself as the Morrigan, he basically Cuchulainn and says, "I wouldn't have healed you if I knew it was you." But anyways, if you strip away just the surface level of the story, it's a guy who has these challenges. He goes into a frenzy or fury, and then afterwards he's offered the milk from the crone. So that's how she appears in the Ulster cycle. She's also in the Laborga Bala, where she's associated as a member of the Tuatha De Danann. So you've got this link to her there as well. And there's also a 9th century glossary which contains the Latin Vulgate Book of Isaiah. And apparently there's a translation of the word Lamia in there, and the note says a Morrigan. So
whoa,
it actually...
Whoa. Okay. So they're translating the word Lamia, and they're saying it's a Lamia is a Morrigan, or is Morrigan?
So what it says is it's a glossary, and it's which it's kind of like an annotated book of the Book of Isaiah in Latin Vulgate, and it translates the Hebrew. It's not Lamia. There's another word that then gets translated into Lamia, and the guy who's translating it in the note writes a Morrigan, kind of like also known as a Morrigan, and that's in there. And obviously,
so they're making this direct connection.
Yeah, and there's other connections later that I'll go into as I'm going along. And I'm going to have to do a video on this so I can show you all the sources, and it's all there in front of you, and I'm not just paraphrasing it all.
Of course.
But honestly, it's crazy when you look into it. And then you also have a later edition of a person called Morrigan, and they say that means seaborn. Morrigan. So this is in Irish. It's in the Annals of the Four Masters and the Annals of Ulster. And if you look at the old Irish word for Irish sea, it's Muir Eran. So Muir spelled M-U-I-R, and this is exactly how Morrigan is spelt. And then when you compare that to the Welsh, gen means born. So for example, the word for a small boy in Welsh is bachgen. Bach meaning small, gen meaning born. So gen means born in the Welsh as well. And I mean, if these were different groups of people who were traveling between Britain and Ireland, it would make sense that they're going to use the same word. You know, if I go on holiday and I'm telling people about my friend Snappy, I'm not going to translate your name into their language and give them that version. So, you know, that would make sense. So you've got this Morrigan, and she's also known as Muir-Gelt, which means mermaid. So the word, so even mer is Muir in Irish, and you can see it even in the Spanish. You know, more it means the sea. And this is where Morgan Le Fay comes from as well, according to some sources, means sea-born, Mor, because Mor in Welsh is the sea. So Morgan is sea-born, and Fay is fate.
That's amazing. That's wild. And again, it connects us back to this the Median kind of idea, right? Like Aphrodite is seaborn, right?
Yep, exactly. Yep. That's why I think people get carried away. They see, the Phantom Queen, oh yeah, that's kind of mysterious and spooky, but Seaborn's got levels beyond that. You know what I mean? I think people just jump they jump on that, and when you do a bit more digging and you go back further back, you can see that it seems to have this sea connection, which if you know this mythology, this Greco-Roman mythology, you know where that's coming from,
right? And like you were telling me the story of Morrigan and I can't remember the Cuchulainn, right? Or
yeah,
and that to me, like there were elements of that scream of the Orphic Vox, of that coded language, right? The heifer, the milk, the eel could easily be a snake, right?
Yeah.
Like it's wild.
Well, when you look at the Pictish stones that have been found with this sea queen on, which looks very similar to the gold Scythian items that were found in the Ukraine, she has got like the dual tails of a serpent, but it's very serpentine. I think there's a crossover between the sea creature and the terrestrial serpent, and obviously if there were seafaring people, maybe that's why she's a sea serpent,
right,
traveling along the seas. Or
we also have to remember they're not just talking about snakes. When they say snake, they mean serpent, and that implies even the sea version, right?
You know what's really interesting, when I'm looking in medieval books, eels, they didn't know apparently how eels used to mate, and we still
don't.
What they used to think, in these old books, is that snakes would mate with them.
That's wild.
Yeah, there's quite a few old books from the 1800s and stuff that say we think snakes mate with the eels.
Right. That's crazy. And it would make sense too, I think, like just in Britain with the eels, because you guys have such a large eel population throughout the country there, and it's such a staple food, right?
I saw a huge eel last summer. We had a stifling hot summer. I took the kids down to a river, and I was just in the river, and this massive eel just swam up to me. It was silver, like a silvery blue. It was huge, and I've never seen one. It shocked me to start with. I was like, "What is that?" And it was massive, but it was like, it had an impact on me for sure, because it was just, you see it and it's sparkling in the sun, it's silver. It had an impact on me,
right? And this is with you knowing the context. Imagine if you're one of these early peoples who only has hearsay to go on, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Terrifying, right?
Absolutely.
That's crazy. But I wanted you to, so you brought up this idea again of the snakes, and that was a central motivation for you. And like, to me, when I heard that, like, I only understand this myth of removing the snakes in connection to St. Patrick and the Catholic Church about getting rid of the Druids. What's really going on here? Like, because that doesn't seem correct now.
I mean, I think on one hand, I think it is the using that term to denote the Christians that could have been following these practices. Sorry, the pagans who were following these practices, but they also could have been another layer to it for sure. Now, the thing that I found with a lot of these sort of history mythologies, they're almost 50-50 history, 50-50 mythology. And I think the art of what they're doing is they are encoding a hidden layer, but they're tacking it onto a history, if that makes sense. They're tacking it onto historical characters. So I think there's two layers to that. And I'm going to use an example of, there's another story of Merlin, and the king, I believe off the top of my head it could be Vortigern, is building a castle, and for some reason this castle keeps falling down, the foundations keep sinking. So what he does is he goes, I need to sacrifice a boy who isn't born of who's born of like an immaculate birth, essentially. So they find this boy, and it's Merlin, and he's going to sacrifice him and sprinkle his blood on the stones to stop the castle from falling down. And Merlin, being a bit of a prophet and a bit of a extraordinary kid, he says, well, I know why your castle won't stand up, and that's because there's a cave underneath it, and it, you know, it's sinking. And anyways, when they go down there, they find two dragons, and these two dragons are fighting, and one of them's red and one of them's white. But what they say is the white dragon represents the Anglo-Saxons, and the red dragon represents the Cymry, the Welsh. And that red dragon is still the symbol of Wales today. But if you think into your Orphic box, what could the two red and white serpents be?
Right, that's your dote and your antidote, right? That's freaking amazing.
Yeah. It's crazy. Yeah. So it is incredible.
This is the same thing that happened to me when I started applying this kind of thing to the Vedic texts. Like, there's a deeper connection here, even if it's not directly connected, right? Like, there's a hybridization. These people are engaged in these psychedelic practices. They're sharing these ritual ideas and these conceptions of deity across borders, across incredibly vast distances. You know.
You know, I found a couple of old sources, and one was an Indo-European dictionary as well, and they said that Bellinus, you know, from Beltane kind of fame, that they said that was henbane, you know, because in Welsh, melyn means yellow, and the funny thing about Welsh is this thing happens to the words called a soft mutation, depending on the word that precedes it. If it ends in a certain vowel or consonant, the word will mutate. So melyn could be bellin, and this is why coch is red in Welsh, but when it's after draig, so the red dragon is draig goch, because koch translates to goch. The C becomes a G. So the words mutate. So what they were saying is melyn is yellow, but it can be mutated to bellin. And what they're saying is this henbane, Belus, was analogous to henbane. And then when you look at the fire festival, they would have these two mounds burning. They would drive the cattle between it so they could bless the cattle and things. And if they were burning henbane, they would obviously be inhaling the fumes from the henbane, which would be seen as taking on the qualities of that deity, surely. So, so that was quite.
That's really quite impressive. That really, okay, so now you're mentioning the fire festival. This kind of connects me to some stuff that I'm more familiar with, like the writings of Caesar. What do you think about Caesar and his depictions of the Druids and what the Druids are doing? Do you, like in the archaeology and in anything else, have you noticed any of child sacrifice? Are there wicker men? Do you see that kind of motif, or is this propaganda?
I think from what I've seen, it could be propaganda. The only instance I've seen which talks about ashes and human remains are in burials. So, for example, there's a henge near where I was born in the Lake District called Maybury Henge, and it's actually a very unique henge because most of the henges, the embankments are built out of the earth that they dig in to form the ditch in the inside of the ring. So what they would do is they would build a circular ditch, and all of the earth they take out of the ditch goes onto a bank on the outside. So you kind of have where's my handy? So you'd have a bank going up, this way, and then it goes down into the ditch, and then you've got a flat plateau in the middle. But this one, it was actually built entirely out of stones that they took from the nearby river. So they chose to build it near a river, and they chose to go and take stones from the riverbed to construct this embankment. And then inside, they had they believe there was an earlier ring which was made of wood, because when they've had a look down, there's remnants of wooden posts that were around, and then they believe this was later rebuilt with big stones essentially, and they found ashes in there of human remains, which they believe could be burial rites. So in the literature of the archaeology, that's the only thing that I've seen which relates to ashes, and obviously that's massive in the Hindu culture, isn't it? They cremate the bodies as well. So that's all I've seen. So I'm not 100% on anything else, so I couldn't comment other than from what I've seen, it's cremation. They seem to cremate most of the bodies.
Yeah, the other big claim that Caesar sort of makes is that the Druids act as both sort of like tribal leaders and as astrologers, and that they're obsessed with the stars. Do you see that within the actual evidence?
I mean, from where they choose to build the sites. So, for example, in the Lake Districts where I'm from, a lot of these henges, they'll have an entrance, and the entrance will usually align with the setting of the sun. And in the example of Maybury Henge, the sun sets behind a mountain called Blencathra, which some say has got something to do with the devil. The word, I can't remember exactly, but a few sources have said it means, something like peak of the devil or something like that. Now, obviously, it's probably not the devil as as mainstream sort of academia would say the devil. The Christian, it's probably not the Christian ideology, but it faces where the sun sets behind. And even where a lot of these Strathclyde Britons were based, the sea that looks out over to Ireland, there's an inlet that comes in, and it's called the Solway. That's what they call it. And it always the sun sets down there. I don't know if I need to look into that, but I don't know if there's any connotations to that as well. But they certainly seem to have alignments with these structures for sure. Yeah. So I do think they were looking at the stars.
Yeah, like there's been a lot of claims I've seen made about the henges being related to zodiacs, which seems like a stretch, but to say that they're not astrological would also be a stretch.
There's one near me where I am now in Yorkshire, and it's seen as being I think they call it the Stonehenge of the North, and it's actually 3 henges that are linked. And some people said that there are astrological connotations to its layout, but it's a very, very unique site. It's 3 henges, and there's when you zoom out on a map, there's actually quite a lot more in the area, and they seem to follow. There's a motorway called the A1. And they're all lined to this A1, and you find out this A1 is actually an ancient roadway. And it's crazy to think I'm driving on a motorway in my car from 2015, and I'm driving on top of a road that's been used for thousands of years.
Wow,
it's unbelievable. You don't know what's beneath your feet.
That's so cool. Okay, wow. So one thing I really wanted to get into with you, because it just seems such, like, from an outsider's perspective, I don't even know where to begin, because it's the Grail and the Cauldron mystery. Because this is something that seems to be pervasive cross-culturally across Europe. And it stays from our earliest version of European history up until almost the present. What's going on with Arthur and these knights? What are they really searching for? What's this about from your perspective?
Okay, so the Grail, I mean, when you look at some of the earliest artifacts, I know you want to speak about Arthur. We're going to jump onto that, but just quickly, when you look at some of the old artifacts they found from Ireland, pre-BC, some of them are the big sort of cauldrons, but they are grails. Because the grails, it's almost like it's not just a tiny. You realise it's not just a tiny cup. I think the cauldrons are just another word for the Grail. And when you look at some of the relics they've found, they're pretty big. But when you look at the craftsmanship, I think they date some of them to something like 1000 BC. Ireland, and you look at it and you're like, it's crazy how they made it, to be honest. And then all across England, I think you've got 2 or 3 instances where they've found these cauldrons and they're deposited in marshes. So you can see that they've got some kind of reverence for the water, because they interred these grails into the marshes. And they look very similar to, I'm just going to say this one because you've probably heard of it, is the Gundestrup cauldron from Europe. They're kind of like that. And I've read in some sources they even believe that they were built by the same people, because they use the same craftsmanship, which again links back to the continent. Now, looking at the Arthurian sort of legends, the Isle of Avalon is where he goes. He crosses the sea to reach the fabled isle. Now, Avalon comes from Athal, which in Welsh is apple. So it could mean the Isle of Apples. And then you look at these apples, like when you look at Vita Merlini, the life of Merlin, he talks about his apple trees all the time. But what he says is he makes a reference to when the sun is still ascending in the sky. So he's talking about the seasons, over the course of the year, the sun at midday on a certain day, it's in a different position in the sky. And he's talking about while the sun's still ascending. So it hasn't reached the equinox yet, or it hasn't reached equal day, equal night. Now, your apples in England are typically harvested in late September. There are some that bloom earlier, but generally it's later. So to me, it's not a literal apple that he's talking about. And there's references to his apples, and that's what I think the Isle of Apples is to do with whether it's henbane or something. I'm not sure, because I've seen apples of Apollo be referenced to psychedelics as well. So I'm not sure if it's henbane yet. I'm not sure, but there's a link there for sure. It's not just your run-of-the-mill apples he's talking about in this. So the Isle of Apples is the Isle of, could potentially be the Isle of some psychedelic plants. And I've on that topic, going into the Welsh language. So mead in Welsh. So again, just to give some context so everybody knows, the English didn't come in until the Anglo-Saxons arrived in sort of 400 or 500 AD. So English comes from Anglish, and England is Angleland. Prior to that, it was Britain, and they spoke the British language, which survives today in the form of Welsh. So in the pre-English language, it was Welsh. Now, mead in Welsh is spelt M-E-A-D-D, but in Welsh, we pronounce the double D as a th. So it's meath or medd. Drunk is meddw. And there's an old herbal remedy called metheglin, which sounds very similar to medicine. And you actually get the word medic from medig, which is the Welsh for a physician or a medic. And you see that when, I don't have the Welsh name, but Lindisfarne, which was an island, when the Romans came, they called it Medcaut because of the herbal plants that were growing there. Now, from what I've seen when the Romans came and they renamed places, they only really changed the suffix at the end. A prime example is the city of York used to be called Iboracon, and they changed it to Iboracum. So they just changed the prefix. So although I haven't found the British for Lindisfarne, the fact the Romans called it Medcaut, I mean, it even says it was because of the herbal properties were there, but I'm sure it's going to come from the word meth with a different suffix. And so they did have this island where there was medicinal herbs growing there for sure. And obviously when Arthur goes to the Isle of Apples, it's to be healed by the healer, Morgan le Fay. And the Fay comes from Old French, which comes from the Latin fate. So it's Morgan the Fate. And she tries to heal him. So there's definitely a link there. And most, when you look at the Arthurian legend, a lot of it comes from through the Normans, actually comes from the French
Yeah, it's
Normans.
most of it's in French, right? Like the mot
That's right, yeah.
d'ordre and such.
Yeah. And so I think with the Normans, you've kind of got this hybridized mythology, because I mean, even when they're looking at these, sorry to jump around a little bit, but when we're looking at the excavations they're doing just east of York in a place called Pocklington, they're finding these chariots, and the chariots have still got the riders intact, and they've still got the horses intact. And the unique thing is they've buried the horses upright. They're not lying down, they're upright like this, as though they're charging out of the grave almost.
That's crazy.
Yeah, there's almost nothing else like it. The only other place, and this is dated to around 500 BC according to the academics, it links with the Latin culture in France. So, and going back to the Brutus mythology, you've got the links with France in that mythology as well. So is this how it's all come together? Was there a pre-existing link with France? And then when the Britons have gone back to Brittany and intermixed with the Normans, and they've got part of that older French sort of culture, and then it's all combined back together. I think it's got something to do with that personally. That's just my personal opinion. I'm going to do some more digging into it and see what else we can uncover.
No, that's wild. It makes sense, right? Because you see, like, we have to remember, right? Even though these are connected peoples, they're separated by distances and by tribal lines, right? So even though they're going to have shared ideas, it's going to evolve differently, and they're going to be reacting to different contexts, right? So
that's it. And cool. And then when you look at the later sort of mythologies, so we were talking about Morrigan, Morrigan, Le Fay. In Brittany, you've got the Corrigan, just with a K. And even though it's later, so it's closer to where we are now in history, she's kind of depicted as like a little gnome type thing, but she's still seen as a sea sprite with prophetic sort of powers. So even though the image has kind of changed, I don't know if because there's more post-Christian influence,
right?
The key attributes or qualities are still present. And then you've even got a Welsh sea sprite called a Mary Morgan as well. Mari, a Mary Morgan, and she's a sea sprite. But again, this is a later sort of incarnation of the myth, so to speak.
That's so cool. One thing I wanted to ask you about, so we know in the Christian and in the Greek context, we see this vilification of underworld deities. Specifically, right, you have the transformation of Saturn from a beneficial to like the absolute evil. The figure that I'm most familiar with absolute evil in the Celtic various mythologies is Crom. Is something similar happening there? What's the story with this figure?
I've not dived into that too much, to be honest. I couldn't really give you a great answer on that. But what I will say is there is a character called Baelor, and he's got the evil eye. So he's apparently got this evil eye that can kill you with a stare, and apparently he has 7 eyelids that he has to close. So that he just doesn't destroy everything, basically. So he's got quite an underworld kind of attribute to him. But what I have found in some of the old books, there's one called Ogier, and it was written by Roderick O'Flaherty in the late 1600s. And he actually writes, there's a guy called Con of the 100 Battles, and it actually says during the Saturnian rule of Con of the 100 Battles. So there are people attributing the Saturnian sort of attributes surrounding him. So I do think there's something going on there for sure. I just need to delve into it a little more. So I'm sorry I haven't given you a brilliant answer there. But
no, that's a good. There's so much of this kind of stuff going on, and like the other kind of figure that you generally see that's vilified within European myths, and you see this wildly cross culturally, are these ideas of like these horned wild men, and you already mentioned kind of one with Merlin. Do you see other parallels, or these like, do you see any parallels to like satyrs or like to this Dionysian kind of ecstatic kind of thing going on?
Yes, so I mentioned earlier about the Corvetti tribe, who
Hmm.
means from the deer, of the deer, and we haven't got, there's not much archaeology on them, to be honest. But further down south in Britain, you do have these antlers. They found antlers, and it's part of the skull that was worn on the heads, and they had the antlers attached to the top part of the skull. So yeah, they have found, and you can go and see some of them in some of the museums that are close by. Actually, it's quite incredible. So they did seem to have a link with the horns, and obviously you've got Cernunnos, who's the
Right.
horned one, and you see him on the Gundestrup cauldron. He's sat there cross-legged, kind of in a
A yoga.
meditative
I brought that up because when
state.
we look at the oldest version of this horn figure that we have is in Harappa in the Indus Valley, right? Like, and we're talking the early Bronze Age, and it's
Yep.
the same. It almost looks exactly like the figure you see on that cauldron.
Yeah, and what's he got in his hand? He's got a snake in one hand,
Right.
and he's got a ring in the other hand. I think, off the top
Yes.
of my head. So the symbology is there for sure. And what's interesting as well is you've got obviously Buddhism, but you've also got Bardism in the Welsh, and Buith Dda means good life in Welsh, and I mean it's not related, but it's so
Yeah,
interesting
it's
that
so it's so close. Well, the bardic tradition always struck me because where are the mysteries presented within the Greek context? Through
yeah,
the Orphic tradition, which
yeah.
is a musical bardic tradition, right?
Oh
You
yeah,
know,
and when you look at these bards, they're obsessed with Arwen, who is the muse, and
right,
you know because their job was to retell history, stories, um, information. But as you know, the best way to remember something is through song. And
right.
they would invoke the muse because they weren't supposed to write anything down. They had to store it all up here. So, and when they invoke the muse, they almost always say to bring her out of the cauldron, basically. So the Arwen and the cauldron are almost linked together, and that's what they're doing. You know, you've got Taliesin, and his name means, when you translate Taliesin, it means something like bright shining forehead or something like, you know, something like that. Again, I'm paraphrasing. I'll have to have a look at exactly what it means, but it's something along those lines. And he's this magical bard, and you know, he's always invoking the muse. He's always invoking Arwen, and the story of Arwen is actually quite interesting in itself. So the
Yeah, can
symbol,
you tell us that a bit?
yeah. So the symbol of Arwen is the three rays. So it's kind of like this, you know, like a.
Hmm.
Don't know if you can see that.
Yeah, yeah.
And the story goes, there was a giant called Einigan, and apparently he saw the sun's rays coming through the clouds in these three sort of angles, and it it gave him knowledge. And what he did is he decided to write the image down on a piece of wood. He's carved it into a piece of wood called an e-bill, and from that was developed the Welsh runes, which are called Cauldron. Now, when you look at what scholars say, they just say, "Oh, this Cauldron, these runes, it's all just made up. It was made up in the 1800s." But what you have to bear in mind is a lot of these traditions were sort of oral. Like, you know, as I was saying, the bards, they didn't write anything down, and then you've had years of suppression from other cultures. You know, at one time, if the Welsh were caught with writing implements, it was an imprisonable offence, and
Right.
and
Now
they
you see a
even
lot of comparison, like, so I've studied a lot of the tarot history, and
Mhm.
the reality is like you get two streams of tarot, but only one stream survives to modern day, and that was the stream
Right,
within secret societies. There was a women's stream,
yep.
but paper doesn't survive, and this was hidden and largely burned. We only have it in reference, you know, so we don't know what these women were doing. We can only
That
speculate.
That's it, exactly. And the crazy thing is, people who owned like farmsteads, they're passed down through families, and it wasn't uncommon for people to go into an attic somewhere and go, I've just found a load of stuff written down from God knows when in the past,
Right.
and then they would collate it all and rewrite it, and that's what this guy Iolo Morganwg was doing. He was finding a lot of these, and he was compiling them and rewriting them. But modern history say, oh, he was a charlatan. He was just making stuff up.
Well,
But
this is one of those things that gets really like interesting to me because okay, when I was studying a lot of this stuff in academia, the perspective you were just presenting was the one that most people have. All of this was invented in the Renaissance by these rich nobles who were just playing dress up. But where are they getting it from? Like when we go back to these texts, like there's something to it, and it seems to me like there is this ongoing secret tradition. It just becomes public as the social mores start to change.
yeah, I definitely think that it's going on. I mean, you can see it, and even this story about Einigan. So when he writes these runes on the e-bills, the wooden e-bills, apparently the people in the story, the people start worshipping the e-bills themselves rather than the meaning behind them. So in the mythology, he then dies of a broken heart, and the wood that I'm trying to think what tree it was from. I don't know if it was acacia maybe. But anyways, when he dies, somebody rediscovers his skull later on, and the pieces of wood he carved them on have regrown, and two of them are growing out of his eyes, and one of them is growing out of his mouth. And so you've got the triplicity there as well. And this isn't a theme that you see even in the bog bodies that they've found. These bodies that have been interred into a bog, they've been simultaneously killed by three ways: strangulation, being hit on the head, and having the throat cut.
Right?
Something
And
along
isn't that
those
also
lines.
in the Merlin myth? So like yeah, because isn't Merlin die three ways when he
There's
finally ceases?
in Vita Merlin, he gives a prophecy. So what happens? The king, the king gets him back, the king's wife is Merlin's sister, and he says she's not been faithful to you, and she's got a leaf in her hair, and he takes it out. So she develops a plan. She goes, right, I'm going to get this kid who's in court. I'm going to bring him out, and I'm going to say, how's he going to die? And she gets Merlin to give this prophecy. And obviously, on the surface level, these prophecies are wrong. They dress the guy up as they dress the kid up as a girl at one point as well, and he's meant to not realize it's the same person who comes back three times, and he gives him three separate prophecies. So then the queen goes to the king, he doesn't know what he's talking about, he's just crazy. And the king's kind of like a bit gutted. But then later on, when this kid wakes up, he's hunting, and he has this hunting accident where he falls off a cliff, and he lands with his foot caught in a tree, and he drowns as well. So he dies a triple death.
Wow.
So he gives this prophecy that then does come true later with a triple death. So you have this theme
Amazing.
of this triplicity everywhere.
That's so cool. Okay, so another thing. So one of my favorite topics to get into is magic and necromancy, and when I've done a fairly good study of the Greek and the Indian versions of this, and it seems to come down to a couple things that are mandatory, and I want to know if you see these things within the Celtic contexts. So those things are: one, you have some kind of female leader who's teaching or running the rite. Okay. Two, there's some kind of cave or hole that's a portal. Sometimes it's a mirror, but it's a portal into the underworld. Then the third is blood sacrifice, usually of black animals. Do you see this within the mythology?
With the female leaders, certainly in the mythology, you've got very strong female characters, and as we've discussed, the Morrigan, she's very much a prophetess, and she's also a goddess of war. So that's a theme you'll have seen. And there's quite a lot of these female characters in there that have got a lot to do with witchcraft, healing, the cauldron, So yeah, 100% that is definitely there. There's also, I've seen some books that talk about the female druids as well. There's not a lot written about them, but there was a female druid class. I believe one of the sources I've seen is when the Romans go and they kill the rest of the druids off, they go to the Isle of Anglesey, which was apparently the stronghold, which is an island just off the northwest coast of Wales today. And that is one documented instance where there's female druids, and apparently they're on the shores with fire, shouting curses and stuff. The shouting curses at the Roman army. And I've seen other sources talking about them, but they don't go into much detail. But there was definitely a female class of druids. There was also, it's known that there was 3 classes in druidism. There was the druids, the bards, and the ovates. So it seems like the druids were in charge of the laws. The bards were in charge of the history and the lineages. So they would be kept normally by a king, and their duty was to be able to recall all of the lineages. So when the king's going to...
So the story of like the Druidic college is real then? It actually existed at Anglesey? Because I've heard that kind of told. And it seems
apparently that was the last stronghold of the druids.
Okay, cool.
And that's when... No, it's all good. And that's where they went to exterminate the last of them, supposedly. So that's what a lot of the sources say. You've also got the ovates, who were in charge of prophecy and healing. So I don't know if that was the female class. I'm not sure yet, but it would make sense that there were, because as we know, a lot of the medicine came from childbearing and childbirthing and such. So it would make sense if the ovates were possibly the female class. Again, I'm not 100% sure on that.
For sure.
But it's something I'm going to look into for sure. Mm-hmm. Now, caves, yes. Actually, it's funny you say that, because maybe about 10-minute drive from me, there's a lot of cave networks. And it's quite a unique place, because you've got this, I think it's limestone, and you look at it and it can be 20 meters high, and it's just like a rock face. And there's a town called Knaresborough, and it's built. There's a river that goes between these two. The river's almost cut out a valley in this rock, and a lot of old books say that it's been used since time immemorial. And there's even houses now that are still there that are cut into the rock. So the house is inside the rock, and the front of it is just like a normal house. And you can see these holes in the wall. And apparently what they would do, they would have what we call lean dwellings, where they would use the face as the main structural load bearing of the house. And then they would lean a roof off it, and they would live in there in really, really old times. Now, I was investigating these caves, and we have a story of a guy called Sir Robert Flowers who lived in one of these caves. And he apparently lived an ascetic lifestyle, living off herbs and roots. He was healing people, and apparently he had quite a following. And he would have people that would come and congregate around his caves, so much so that the aristocrats would come and they would break it up and say he wasn't allowed to do it. Now, on the surface layer, he's a saint. But when you look into his history, before he died, he was telling his followers, do not let them take me, because they will put me in a church. They'll put my remains in a church. And he's going, do not let them take my body. And he didn't want to get put in this church. But we know there's a habit of canonizing certain people.
Right.
And then I've found some other old books, and apparently there was an old Knights Templar who was living in this cave before he got there. And this Knights Templar was on the run. And he kind of taught him how to live this lifestyle. And then further up the road, I'm talking only a 10-minute walk, there's another cave. And today it's called the Lady of the Crag. And it's this
Wow.
shrine that's built into the cave, and it's there's a Knights Templar carved on the rock outside, and inside you've got a shrine to the Madonna. Now on the wall
Is
of
it a
this
Black
cave,
Madonna by chance?
well, unfortunately, the original's been removed.
Oh, okay.
So it could have been, and now there's a bit of a it's not very well done. It's a crude effigy inside, and it's been done later. Now on the altar, there were originally these three heads on the altar. They've been removed, but there's one face that's still on the wall, and I've seen there's a phallus stone in Cumbria, near where I was born, and it's basically like a phallus shape. On the top, there's a crude face carved into it, like with its tongue sticking out. On the back of it, there's a snake going down the back of it.
I've seen that exact symbol in India in reference to Adrinahari Ishvara, which is the combination of Shiva and Kali as one being.
Right.
With the snake in the face, like what the hell?
That's crazy. That's crazy because you know what? Apparently these. I'm going on a tangent here. Remember to get back to the caves in a minute.
Of course.
But a lot of these farmers. So there was these things called thunderstones that they had, which I got onto this when I was looking at this serpent stone, and the only other place I could see similar ones was in Karelia, which is in Scandinavian sort of territory.
Yeah,
and
North Finland.
Yeah, and they saw them as thunderstones. And when you look at, I was talking about Ukko before, and the Vasara and how it's etymologically linked to the Vajra in Hinduism. Well, these thunderstones were kind of worshipped in a similar way to the Shivlings. So they would anoint them with milk or beer, and they would pour milk or beer over them. And when I've looked at some old books from farmers in Scotland and in the area, these old Neolithic monuments were offered milk, and they would pour milk on them. And when you go there today, you can clearly see erosion. They'll usually have a little dish area where you can see stuff's being poured in, and it's ran out, and they've been doing it that much, it's even eroded it away. And obviously then rain's going to get into it, and it's going to perpetuate the erosion. But yeah, apparently that's what they were doing. They were pouring milk on these old Neolithic stones. But
my gosh,
getting back to the cave.
yes, go back to the caves. Great tangent, thank you for that.
Yeah, I'll get lost down that tangent if we keep going. That's why I'm getting back to the cave. But the face on this phallus stone is very similar to the face that's etched into the cave. Wow. It seems to me, it looks like it's more pre-Christian. It doesn't look Christian at all. It's very crude. It's just a circle, two eyes, and like a mouth sticking its tongue out.
So you couldn't tell if it was feminine or not, but is a tongue sticking out? Because that screams Kali.
Yeah, kind of like this. It's weird, but it looks very similar to the Irish Boa Island figures or the Kurgan style figures that you see in Europe. It's kind of like that. So to me, it looks pagan. Again, I'm not an expert, but it looks to me definitely looks pre-Christian. And when you look at when I went to visit it, there was like a leaflet you could buy about it. I always buy it because I like to see what they say about it. And it does say in there that the cave could have been used before the Knights Templar used it. And what's even more interesting, so you've got, because there was a Knights Templar training ground nearby as well. So they were in a place called Temple Newsham, which is in Leeds, which isn't too far away. And there was another training place nearby to Knaresborough. So they were in the area. And actually, Knaresborough Castle, I can't remember who the name of the guy was, but there was three of them that killed a bishop at in one period of time. They killed him in the church, and it was at the order of the king. But then the king said, they took it out of context. They didn't mean go and kill him. And they were on the run, and they hid in Knaresborough Castle. So when I found this book, and it says that when Robert Flowers went into the cave, like, there was a Knights Templar on the run. I'm wondering if there's something to do with that. But there were certainly Templars in the area, and they were using these caves.
Okay,
But
because we know for sure. So it's crazy that you bring up the Templars, because the Templars, whether or not they are directly have the mystery, they are essential to the Renaissance version of the mystery cults and to the occult revival, right? Like Alpheus Levy claims that his entire book is basically based upon their ideas, and they become an essential force of this whole thing. So there's something going on there. Do you see any of these kind of like classic Templar symbols besides the crosses? Like, do you see any Baphomets or anything like that?
Not so much. I haven't seen the Baphomet anywhere, but when I go to the aristocratic homes, so Temple Newsom's a prime example. There was an old Knights Templar building there, and later on they built Temple Newsom on the site. When you go to these aristocratic homes, it's just full of Greco-Roman motifs, Bacchic sort of imagery everywhere. So it's definitely preserved even in the later incarnations. And there's a theme that seems to reoccur, is a lot of these sites, when you look into the history of them, they've been built on top of older and older and older sites. So you have a Roman site built on top of a British site that was then built on by the Anglo-Saxons, that were then built on top of by the Normans, because obviously a lot of them are in strategic places. So it makes sense. And but what really got me, this is actually how one of the main threads of how I got onto the Greek sort of mysteries and stuff. There's another cave nearby to the other two, and there was a woman who lived there, and she was a prophetess. Now she's labeled, you see images of her today, and she's got the typical sort of witch, medieval Victorian witch with a hook nose and the hat and flying around on a broom. But when you look at the old books, I've found maybe 3 or 4 old books that specifically say she was a Sibyl.
Oh,
and she
wow.
was from around about the 1400s. She's called Mother Shipton, and she lived in this cave, and she gave prophecies out of this cave. So there's something going on with that area for sure, because that's 3 caves all nearby, and you've got the Templars doing something in the caves. You've got this Sir Robert Flowers who was maybe
a clear
canonized,
magical tradition, right?
Yeah. There's something preserved in that area for sure. And when you go there, there's just so much to see. It's incredible. All the churches in the area are dedicated to the Madonna.
Yeah, there's something going on here, right? Like, and we know, like, it's hard to tell now what the extent was, but we know the Templars were engaged in this pagan practice. At least that's why what the Catholics claim. That's why they killed them all, right?
Yeah.
So
I know they were serving a purpose up until a point, and then it got too much for the Catholic Church, I believe.
Yeah, the big thing that most academics highlight is banking, which I'm sure is the motivating factor. But how were they able to convince the public to agree? And that's where I think the pagan influence comes in. Like always, sure. That's how the church is able to justify violence, right?
Yep, that seems to be the case for sure.
Right.
You read some of those texts. The Romans wanted rid of those druids,
right? Well, this is how the entire history of the Druids begins, right? In Caesar's propaganda, It's like
barbarians. They need civilized.
Yeah, it's crazy.
We need to rein these people in.
Right, but yeah. Okay, so I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the drugs. So you had mentioned henbane. So, like, when I'm studying the Indian mysteries, the key drugs in the Indian mysteries seem to be revolving around snake venom, marijuana, datura, and Syrian rue. Or ephedra. What are you noticing? Is there any of these kind of drugs that are making it into the British versions of these mysteries?
Well, they don't seem to mention anything by name as such, but when you do some diving, it does seem like henbane in particular seems to be quite prominent. Mm-hmm. And in one source that I found, because the Celts, I use the term Celts mainly because that term wasn't used until the early 1700s when a guy called Edward Ludd kind of used it to
Oh, I
group.
didn't know.
Yeah, they kind of used it to group these people of a similar language together. But I believe it's a lot more nuanced than that. But anyways, he links this particular group with some of the Gauls. And as we've spoken about earlier, you can see these Brigantes were sort of in the Rhine Danube region. And he even says they used to use henbane on the spears and arrows in the Gallic territories. So they used to use it for hunting and for weaponry as well. And from what I've read, they would rub it on the feet as well. Actually, they would make a tincture and rub the henbane on the feet. And I've seen different records saying of what it can do. So it can induce anything from a mild sleep, give you wild dreams. It can also kill you depending on how you ingest it. And
Wow.
they used it for various things from on the weapons, and it looks like they were using it. It says about these prophecies.
That's really interesting with the killing you stuff, and because you mentioned earlier the bulls, is there any connection with the henbane and bull's blood? Because within the Greek tradition, you have this: the bull's blood will put you to sleep, but it could also kill you. That just it screams to me,
Well, in one of the cattle raids that Cuchulainn kind of goes on, there's one story where him and these other people are riding the bull, right? And this bull's going crazy, and some of them can't take it, and they fly off the bull. And then one of the female priests or female figures, she kind of gives Cuchulainn the strength to hold on and ride the bull out. So I think it's an analogy for something. It's not literally people on a bucking bronco. It's an analogy for something. And
because there's so many drugs associated with the cows, right? Like we have the blood mystery, but then there's also the mushrooms. Like, have you seen any references to the cow feces or mush? Because like within the Vedas, that's like everywhere.
It grows out of the cow dung, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Basically. And I mean, all it takes is you go out. I can just go across the street. Well, it's not a street. I live in quite a rural area. I can go into a field at the right time of year, and they'll be everywhere. So that it does grow abundantly in the area. We have these magic mushrooms, and they're everywhere at the right time of year. So I've seen some references to the mushrooms as well. So I don't know if it was a concoction they were using of various different things. I mean, that would make sense. But
like the mushrooms, for example, we know are a key part of the Mycenaean, ritual. So this again brings us another connection back to the Greek, if that's going on.
That's it. Yeah, you've got, like you said, the Mycenaean culture for sure. It's linked to the Greek, so who knows what they brought over. I mean, I just hope that we can get in the future they can use techniques to find out, what are in some of these vessels that they find, these cauldrons and stuff. I'm not sure if when the cauldrons were found, the ones they've already found, I don't know if they had the technology to do that at that time, but it would certainly be interesting to find out what was into them. But I mean, even in that story about Merlin with the two dragons, the red and the white, you know what I mean? They're definitely writing about it in coded sort of speech for sure.
It seems too on the nose, right? And we have another coded tradition just existing down the way in other parts of Europe, so it would make sense, right?
And there's I'm going to paraphrase again, but there's people who write about the history of Britain, and there was one of them. I was mentioning Arwen, the muse. Yeah. Well, the people who are under the influence of the muse are called Arwenith, and there's people who've written about it, and it says that they shake furiously and then fall into a deep sleep, and then they'll start rambling stuff out again. And
they also get super horny.
It doesn't mention that, but. Okay. But it could because I think they were a bit prudish round about this kind of era. Do you know what I mean? And I think that's why they were encoding a lot of it. But what it says is to bring them out of this state, they would put milk or honey on the lips to bring them out of this state.
That's the money right there.
Yeah. and that's what they were doing. They called them it Cambria back then, which is just another way of saying Cymru, Wales, Cumbria, But yeah, he says that they go into this slumber, they have frantic utterances, a frenzy, and then to bring them out of it, they would put milk and honey on their lips, and then they would wake up and not know what had happened necessarily.
Yeah.
But there was somebody there, obviously, listening to what they were saying.
But have you seen any? So I feel like, okay, if there is this deep connection to the Scythians and the Greeks, then there has to be somewhere within the Isles a deep connection to cannabis. Do you see this somewhere? Is cannabis growing in the Isles? How is it talked about within the mythology?
I haven't seen any mention to cannabis itself. I do know you can grow it in the British Isles. A friend told me that at certain times of the year you can grow it outside, so it is possible to grow it. I've not seen anything talking about that being found. However, we know there were links with North Africa, as I said earlier, with that Barbary ape skull that was found in Ireland. So they were confined to North Africa at that time. So we know that there was trade or travel going on between the two, and cannabis is going to be growing in that neck of the woods. So it's not too much of a stretch to think that it would have been transported up here. We don't know what herbs were growing at the time. When the Romans came, they could have easily just got rid of it all.
No, it's true. I mean, it's almost certain that they were using cannabis just because of how useful it is for seafaring people. So
yeah,
guaranteed it's being used in some form or another. I was just wondering if they had sort of a sacred place for it, but either way, it's interesting to think about.
I'll definitely, it's something I'm keeping an eye out for. So it's I've got it earmarked for when I'm doing my reading.
Because that would be such a find for your Scythian connection.
Yeah, for sure. And just the way they say the Tuatha De Danann came down in a cloud, that's
right. Exactly. I mean, there is this thing that I also noticed. So, like, one of the things that gets really confusing when we're trying to trace these mysteries, like in my studies, we noticed that the Vedic Soma ritual begins in Afghanistan. Then it kind of separates into two traditions. One becomes the Indian Soma that then migrates down into the Indus Valley. And then the other one becomes the Iranian Homa that travels into Iran. And they take on very different drug traditions. But we can see the older traditions still surviving in the text. So what ends up happening is you get this obscuring that happens. And then there's also, we're not sure, are there hidden drugs? Like a classic thing you see is maybe soma is a missing plant. And we see references of these missing plants like within the Greek and Roman, like silphium. Do you have any hidden or missing plants within the Welsh or the British mythology?
Not as such, but I do know when I was researching henbane, it doesn't seem to grow much in the UK anymore. It's only found in kind of niche places. So I don't know if that's because it's they've tried to eradicate it at some point. I'm not sure, but you would have thought when you look at kind of the other plants and things that grow in the country, because the climate doesn't change too much between the north of England and the south of England. It tends to grow. If it grows in one place, it grows everywhere. You know what I mean? And the fact that it's only confined to small places indicates to me that it was probably more widespread at some point. So
yeah, it could have been over harvesting, or it could have been, like you said,
of course,
systematic destruction, like
or it could just be because people were aware that it could potentially kill people. They could have, at certain times gone, we need to get rid of it because it's dangerous as well, because you have that with, ragwort and stuff. It can kill horses and things. So people see that growing, they just get rid of it right away.
Right.
So it could just be something as simple as that.
And then the other thing I wanted to ask you about is you mentioned the mead and medwa. Do you see any references to psychedelic honey or any traditions surrounding honey within the British Isles?
Yeah, I mean, you've got the Queen Bee at Beltane Fire Festival. and you do kind of have this. There's quite a lot of beehive symbols when you go through all of the aristocratic houses in England and stuff. The beehive seems very prominent. Now, as far as my research has gone, I haven't started looking for it yet. It's on my list, but it's certainly, you see it on coats of arms and things like that. So the symbolism's there. These aristocratic families do seem to have it in the symbolism. I've just not delved into the actual searching for it in old books and stuff yet. But I do expect to find something there, because obviously you've got the title of the Queen Bee at the Beltane Fire Festival and stuff. So it is embedded in there somewhere for sure.
That's awesome. Okay, so we're coming almost up to the 2-hour mark, so I'm going to start winding things down a bit. So I would like, if anyone has any questions or whatnot for Andrew Auld Boy, please ask them. We do have one question here that I wanted to bring up. It says, this is from Tammy. She says, I wanted to ask Andrew if he could consider researching the ties between Cardenas Castle and the lairds of Miratun and Coululad. Do you know anything about that?
It's not something I've looked into at the moment, no, but I'm quite happy to pursue things. So definitely, if you want to, if you just write a comment on one of my, underneath one of my videos, I'll look into it for sure. You know, I'm always happy to research new areas, so for sure I'll look at that. Definitely, I'll consider looking at that.
That's awesome. And then I wanted to get your kind of grander opinion on a lot of this kind of comparative mythology and what you think it all means and what's going on. Do you think it's just a sign of greater trade networks and closer ties, or is there something else going on here? What are your thoughts?
When you look at some of the older texts, there was a catastrophe in the Mediterranean at a certain period of time. And when you look at that Asia Minor area, you've got a lot of volcanoes in that area. It's very volcanic. So I'm wondering if there was a bit of an exodus from that area after this catastrophe, that, you know, it's caused upheaval. People are looking for new places to live and so forth. And there's, for example, Orgia by Roderick O'Flaherty. He kind of speculates if that was the cause. But there was certainly, I mean, it was a massive disaster from what I'm led to believe.
Yeah,
you know, it affected everyone in that area.
We have so much evidence of this Bronze Age collapse, at least in it's like what happened after, but we have so little of what potentially caused it. I mean, the environmental stuff definitely seems to be at play, but you have these massive cultures that just disappear, you know, without any evidence of a fight. Like,
and I think as well, what you also have to bear in mind is people that are traveling, when they get to certain areas, there's already people living there, and they emerge, and then the culture kind of becomes something different. The language takes on its new sort of connotations, and you know, the art and things like that, that all takes on new sort of connotations and goes in a new direction. So it could be a case of, you know, they haven't vanished, but they've just kind of joined with the people who were where they ended up. And that could be why we now have these different groups of, you know, they call them Celts if you want, but if they were from Scythian background originally, they could have, you know, met and become something new, and the language has changed and evolved. You know, that stuff's always going to be changing. I mean, look how much it's changing even now.
Right.
You know, our language is constantly changing.
Right. I think it's important. Like, what we see is we don't ever really see, like, people are always afraid of cultural death, which is but in modern times, you don't really see that. You see is transference, you see displacement, you see this evolution. But the cultural ideas, they don't ever really completely disappear. They get usurped into these greater cultures. Like, I remember when I first was studying India, the original narrative that was always promoted was that the Indo-Aryan peoples move in and there's a war and there's a displacement that happens. But we have no physical evidence of this. What we do have evidence of is this intermingling, and we can see the tradition evolving to where it incorporates much of the indigenous Indian myth into it and becomes entirely Indian, something
Yeah.
uniquely new.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to be said for that, because they even say that they can't really find they're not exactly sure what happened to the people who were originally in the British Isles. They're not
Right.
exactly sure what happened to them. They don't know. There's no sign of of a mass culling. But they could have just mixed together. They could have
Yeah.
just joined their joined the cultures together and had a fusion to become something else. I mean, that's certainly, as you've said, what you see in other areas. So,
Right.
why wouldn't that be the case elsewhere?
Like, I think
And
we need to start pushing it back against some of these academic narratives of warfare, right? Like, there's
Mhm,
this prevalent myth that you see. I do think there is some usefulness to this and some truth to this, but there's this idea of this war between your so-called nomadic peoples who are based around animals, either horses or cows or sheep or goats, and then your farming societies, which are
mhm,
sedentary and based around the fertile pastures. It's clear that these two groups are going to come into conflict, especially as they expand. They're going to be competing for the same
exactly.
natural resources. But I think that we see this framing of academics where it's a war, where it's one patriarchal, like they even depict it, right? All of the horse peoples are patriarchal. They come and displace the effeminate farmers. But then you get the Scythians, and they're not patriarchal. They're a
Oh yeah,
whole culture that's female led, and like,
yeah.
and
I
within, go ahead, sorry.
Oh no, I was just saying, just on what you were saying there. I read an article a couple of weeks ago that said that they'd even found silk robes that the Scythians were wearing, and also fake beards and stuff that were made out of real hair.
It's
So,
amazing.
so they were obviously, they were warriors one day, and another day they were wearing what we would consider, feminine sort of garb. And I think it's only I don't know why people are scared of that these days. Do you know
It's
what I
so
mean? I
funny.
don't I don't understand the fear around that. It seems to be part of what culture was like back in the day. You know what I mean? So I do think it's a fear thing
Oh, it
at the bottom of
definitely
it.
is, and it's a bygone idea of, like, religion that's been imposed upon us. Because if you think about these things rationally, like we all should do, if you were in a small tribal community, how are you going to handle trans and queer people? You're going to incorporate them into your society. You're going to make room for them. You're going to allow them to transition into a woman's role or into a man's role, and it's going to be natural. And you see this everywhere. So, like, it just doesn't make
Yeah.
sense to me why people get so bent out of shape about that kind of stuff.
No, I don't. I mean, come on. I mean, I can remember being a young child, and came downstairs in my mum's clothes. You know what I mean? It wasn't
Right.
it wasn't anything weird about it. It was just it's just something you do when you're growing up.
Well,
You know what I
and this
mean?
is something like, and this is something we really see with modernity, is this calcification, this uh everything has to be black and white and has to become rigid. And when you look at these earlier cultures that are polytheistic, they don't have that same rigidity. You know,
No, not at all.
people are allowed to go into their to make their own space.
Yeah, and like I think it was also homage to the powerful women that they had in the cultures as well. You know what I
Right.
mean? That they had really prominent roles from what I'm reading. I'm talking specifically about the British Isles. That the mate they wouldn't save that much space for these characters in the mythology if they weren't really important, powerful people. And that they were most likely revered. And when you look at other cultures, such as the Scythians, you can kind of see that. So yeah, that
No, I think I think you bring up an interesting point, because one thing I really see is that we take our modern experience and we like to transplant that upon the past. And it's like,
yeah,
I am not saying that the past was not a violent place that was abusive, but it does a disservice for us to put these current dynamics of male and female upon the past, and to think that they were oppressing and degrading women in the same way that we are. Like, it's very clear that women were subservient most of the time in many of these cultures, but there's also women who have extraordinarily prominence and power across the world. And like, we're talking about thousands of different cultures. Like, it's so frustrating dealing with modern academia that wants to see everything through these layers of oppression and women as a secondary figure when it's not true. Like, we're back, we're putting our own perspective on the past, you know?
Yeah, and you know what? Even I'm an open-minded guy, but even I've realized how different everything was, and how you do imprint your concepts. Even when you go, okay, this is 2000 years ago, I think I've got a pretty good idea of how different society is. But then when you start really digging into it, you're like, it was actually way more different than I could have ever comprehended. You know what I mean? It is just so different. And I think people need to accept that, how different it was back then. You know, this is where we came from.
Right? We need to practice some nuance here. Like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
trans people have existed across history, but that concept, trans, this is a modern concept. It does us a disservice to put that ideas onto the ancestors. I'm not saying we do not talk about gender, but we talk about gender, and we talk about gender in the way that they talk about gender. You know, like, I think it's very important that we understand, like, with these Greek characters, these people are becoming women, and they're understood as women, or they're becoming men and are understood as men. There's not a third category that we have, you know, like, it's not our understanding of these issues.
I think just today that the concept, they want to put things into a very small box, and it's so much more nuanced than that. And you know, when you look at these old cultures, you can see that. And I do think, you know, it's a tricky world to navigate right now. You know what I mean? Everything's so divided and so split, and the nuance is kind of being lost.
It's become so politicized. Like, I think that there's something really great to be gained from looking, like, just since we're talking about the trans and going back to the past and celebrating and look for these figures. But I also see a insidious politicization that's trying to put a modern category onto the past that just does a disservice to the past. Like, you can use the past to help us understand the present. Don't project the present onto the past.
Yeah, you know? Yeah, that's a very good point. Yes,
right?
Yeah, like, for sure. People are just like to use things for their own agenda, and it's just a warped, skewed image of it, essentially.
Right? You can, like, I am 100% for, and I think we need to criticize the present through the lens of the past. But there's no point in criticizing the past through the lens of the present. Like, the past is done. You know?
Exactly. Yeah. And the lens of today doesn't work.
No.
Projecting it backwards, you know, it was so different. It was just so different.
No, but yeah, sorry to go off on a crazy.
No, not at all. I think it's worth talking about, you know.
But right, like, this is why I think, like, bringing this all back around, why I loved your channel and wanted to have you on and was so excited for this conversation, because you are someone who's taking this upon themselves as an amateur, but you're an amateur who is using academic techniques and is invested in learning. Like, you're teaching yourself the Welsh, you're teaching yourself the Greek. And the reality is, there's not that much distinction between an amateur and a professional other than these tools. And if you gain these tools, like learning the languages, you're a professional. But you don't have that baggage of academia now.
I knew right away I needed to learn the Welsh language, and you know, the plan was to learn the Gaelic too. But then obviously the opportunity to learn the Attic Greek came along, and I had to grab that with two hands, because that kind of opportunity just doesn't come along every day.
No.
And once I'm a little bit more savvy with the Welsh and the Greek, I will go on to the Gaelic eventually, you know, because I think you need to. I think it connects you to that history. It connects you to that mythology, and it gives you clues about what's going on, because that's the thing that I've noticed about Welsh and Greek is almost the concept behind the language is very similar. You know, the Welsh has 7 vowels, and that's an inflected language as well. So, you know, the inflections are also there, and the verb, as I said earlier, medd, that which means mead, you can tell that these words are linked, because you've got medd, meddu, meddaglin, you know, meddig, they're all using that key and they're just changing the ending, and that's just the way Welsh works, really. So it opens new doors and it reveals things about name places, people's names. So,
Right.
for example, Prince Maelgwn in the Welsh annals, you can then find out his name means princely hound because of the components that go together to make his name. They're not just crazy names that are made up that don't really mean anything.
This is something that's so key, and like Amon has shown us this so directly in his work. It's like,
Yeah.
right, what does he always say? You've never even read the Bible if you haven't read it in the Greek, because you're not understanding the context and the nuance. And it's also, it's like, again, dealing with this idea of looking at the past through a modern lens. If you're looking at the past through the modern language, like language entirely defines how you perceive the world, right? Like, as someone, like, I grew up speaking French, okay, from a minority culture, right? So this is something I deeply understand, right? Like, this is a huge part of our culture, is maintaining that language, because if you lose that, you lose your entire perspective. It's gone, right? And my dad was like, no, you need to speak French because you need to see the world how I saw the world, and that'll disappear. You know?
Yeah, and it's crazy how the word, it does give you an image in your mind. You know, you hear a word and you've got a preconceived concept of that, and it recalls it in your memory.
So if we really want to understand these people, we need to have that language to see the world through their perspective. Like, you can't do it 100%, but without the language, you can't do it at all. You know, we have to just be honest. And it's go ahead, sorry.
I knew that from the outset, and I thought, I need to learn these languages. I need to be able to go and read it and pronounce it how it's supposed to be pronounced, and to be able to fully read it and get what the words are actually saying. You know what I mean? It's
unfortunately, it
super
took me a while to figure that out. I had to go through religious history, and I have a degree in religious history, but so much of a religious history isn't worth the paper it's written on.
Yeah.
You know, it's, at least when they're trying to talk about the ancient past, you know, because they're not even engaging with the language or the text.
It's a shame, isn't it?
They were written. You know,
it's a shame. You know, it obviously takes them a lot of time to write these things. So you just think, why not do it properly the first time? You know what I mean?
But this
it's
is
a
the
shame,
thing, right? So much of it is about politics and about, right, like all of this stuff, right? Who's paying for it? Right? That's the reality. We need to start asking
I guess.
for ourselves. You know, and like, people have this is something that really frustrates me, is how much people have a misunderstanding of the university complex. Like, this is not a bastion of liberalism. These are conservative bastions of government. You know, if liberalism comes out of the university, it's because they teach people how to use reason. That's it. You know?
Yeah. And I'm telling you that I'm just trying to use reason when I'm doing this. Like, I'm educated to a degree level. It's in music tech, but to get there, I had to recognize, you know, how to find sources, how to cite things, and to discern between what's a more credible source over something else. And that's all I'm trying to do is like what Amon says, is, you know, go back to the text, use reason, and like, I'm trying to use that template with what I'm doing. So that's my basis for how I'm approaching.
And you know what? I think you are, and I think honestly, everyone here needs to go check out your channel, because like,
Thank you,
when we were talking about the Scythians, I was really impressed, because like, it would be easy for someone to just, this is the way things are, look at the evidence, but you're like, this is what a scholar said, these are my thoughts on it, and I'm going to bring other texts to refute it, and you make your position. Like, not too many people are doing that on YouTube, especially not amateurs.
Thank you, man. That means a lot. I appreciate your comments.
Right. So we're just going to wind down here. Was there anything else you wanted to bring up about your work, or where your channel's going in the future?
Yeah. So mainly what I'm doing is, because I've seen these similarities, I'm just going to be analyzing the text. So the first one I'm doing is Vita Merlini by Geoffrey of Monmouth. I'm about halfway through doing that. But before I went any further, I thought I need to give a bit of context. So I've done 2 videos on the origin legend of the Britons, the origin legends of the Irish and Scots, and I've just got one more to do about another group of people that keep cropping up in these old books, who were also allegedly in the area. So I'm going to ask the question: were they in the area? Can we find any evidence to support it? or not. And that's going to be the third and final video in that area. And then we're going to look at the mythologies. So that's where the channel will be going.
That's exciting. So we'll be getting to the mystery soon. One last origin.
That's it. Yeah.
So
exactly.
Everyone, make sure you go subscribe to Auldboy. Check him out for great history and mythologies focused on the British Isles. So thank you so much again, Andrew.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you for asking me.
All right, everyone. Thanks again for tuning in to Drawing Down the Stars. You have a great day.
Thank you.